You're listening to Convenience Matters, brought to you by NACS. Whether it's for food, fuel, drinks, or snacks, about half the U.S. population shops at a convenience store every day. We'll talk about what we see at stores and what the future may hold for our industry.
Imagine your life is literally turned upside down. Whether it's a fire, whether it's a disaster, whether it's something that is life-altering, those events happen every 8 minutes, and that's what the Red Cross responds to. By the time this podcast is over, on average, 2 or 3 times they're responding to something and changing somebody's lives for the positive. So today, we're going to talk about what convenience stores and the Red Cross can do together. My name is Jeff Lenard with NACS.
I'm Stephanie Sikorski with NACS.
We're going to talk about what the Red Cross does and what it means to communities that every convenience store is in. And we welcome today Brad Kaiserman, VP of Disaster Operations and Logistics for the American Red Cross.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
So let's just start out by, for those who aren't familiar, NACS and the Red Cross have talked for a year or so in looking at what we can do together because we are in every community. We have a lot of the same interests. And middle of 2017, we formed a partnership where we can share how do we work with each other, how do we help make our communities better. And it was right before the hurricane season. As a result of that, Red Cross just did informal math and said that our members, suppliers, retailers, gave $17 million in disaster relief with those 3 hurricanes alone. And there's a lot we can do. There's a lot of members that are doing an awful lot already, but let's just start out by talking about, I had mentioned a disaster every 8 minutes. Now, of course, that's not a hurricane, that's not an earthquake, but there are disasters that upend lives. Can you talk about what you do in communities?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the mission, let me start with this, and the mission of NACS and the work that convenience stores do is really critically important to the fabric of a community. And I think the Red Cross is the same. The Red Cross is really a volunteer organization. It's funded completely by donor dollars. Some people think it's a government organization. It's not. It's chartered by Congress, but it's a private nonprofit. It's made up of volunteers and people who live in the community. And among the many things that the Red Cross does is disaster relief. It's about alleviating suffering. And so you talked earlier about the fact that we respond to 60,000 events a year. You know, there's home fires in this country. There's over 50,000 home fires a year. And so when the firemen are rolling up the hoses at 2 o'clock in the morning and there's a big puddle of water and this layer of smoke, there's Red Cross volunteers who, by the way, may very well be people who work in convenience stores and people who shop in convenience stores. In fact, I'm willing to bet that they're all one of the two. And they're out there at 2 o'clock in the morning making sure that the people whose homes have burned down have a shelter, have a roof over their head, have something to eat, have emergency supplies. And so you can see very clearly where the nexus is. While convenience stores focus on convenience, they also focus on distribution, supplies, fuel, and serving the community. The Red Cross does that when the normal transactions break down.
And we've talked oftentimes internally about the work that you all are doing and supporting, or in many cases, you are the first responders. And from our standpoint with convenience stores and the operators, oftentimes we've referred to ourselves as the first supporters. And you talked about that linkage. I think that's a great way to talk about it in terms of, you know, we might be the only ones that are open or available for ATM or water or whatever that is.
That's right. I mean, when you think about it, in any emergency, and so what's the definition of an emergency? An emergency is when the resources that you need are exceeded by the demand. That's something that every convenience store understands as supply and demand, right? And so on any given day, if I want water or if I want fuel, I'm going to go to the convenience store. I'm going to go to Circle K, great partner, by the way, to the American Red Cross, in lots of ways. But what happens when commerce is disrupted? What happens when power is out? What happens when suddenly life becomes not convenient, but inconvenient? And that's a gap the American Red Cross fills. And from our perspective, the sooner we can get commerce back up and running and convenience stores start opening, that to me is the first sign. When the first supporters are operating, that's the first sign of recovery.
And small businesses, convenience stores, 60% of them are small businesses. So they probably don't have somebody that's just dedicated to getting back up and running. As you can't predict the next disaster, but you can put in place things that may help you prepare for the eventuality that it might happen. What kind of things does Red Cross suggest or share for both consumers and for businesses to prepare for the unexpected?
So the first thing I'd offer is, one, business continuity, as you pointed out. It's everybody's business, regardless of the size of business. The American Red Cross has a business continuity plan because we have to keep operating too. So one is I think it's important that folks understand that you have to have a plan. And it may be as simple as, first, how do I take care of my employees? And one way you can take care of your employees is by making sure that they're trained to deal with emergencies. They're trained to deal with not just big disasters, but also CPR and things that can happen in the store. So the Red Cross is one of the largest providers of that kind of safety training. And so, it's in your community. Convenience store owners can connect with their local Red Cross chapter or the Red Cross region, and there's training opportunities there for your employees. The other thing is, if your employees need help, that's what the American Red Cross is there for. All you have to do is call us and say to us, hey, our employees, they had a flood, or our employee firehouse burned down. We don't learn everything necessarily from local government. We may learn it from our partners. And the source of intake for us is we're indifferent to that. What we want to know is that people need help, and we want to help those people.
We also, as we've gone through some of the experience with the hurricanes last year, Harvey, Irma, and Maria in particular presented unique challenges because we had heard that they were in desperate need of fuel. And we, through news sources, somebody heard that, well, NACS sells 80% of the gas in the country. They might be able to play a role. And then it was more than just getting the fuel. It was getting the right fuel to the right people. And that involved not just tankers, but getting the right trucks, getting the licensed drivers, getting all those things in line. So we also learned along the way that it's not just responding to the request, but asking some questions so you can clarify, because there's a difference between saying we need food and, well, what kind of food and where do you need it, et cetera. So it was a learning lesson for us, and I assume that you've gone through an awful lot of these things where you just get smarter and smarter. Unfortunately, disasters make you smarter. Are there any things that you have learned that you can share that, here are the 3 questions that you need to think about, or 2 questions when the request comes in, to clarify, to make it as effective as possible?
Yes, and I think I'd preface that by saying there are 5 tasks of crisis leadership, and it doesn't matter whether you are behind a counter, whether you are sitting at a corporate desk, or whether you're running disaster operations. Crisis leadership is crisis leadership, and so first of all, you've got to make sense of what's going on around you. So this goes to your point about asking questions, right? The experience you had in Maria is disaster operations and logistics, the master's class, right? So I think, one, in making sense of what's going on around you, there will always be requests for more stuff or for resources. The disasters are all about resource imbalance, right? Somebody needs something, there's not enough of it. Where do we get it from? And there's not enough for everybody, so who gets it, right? And that is what disaster is fundamentally about. It's a resource imbalance. If the resources weren't imbalanced, you wouldn't be having a disaster. So when you start asking questions to folks, I think you've got to say, tell me what your requirement is. I've often, I used to work in the military, and people would call me and say, I need to have, 5 747s at Tuesday at 9 o'clock. And I said, I don't think that's what you need. I think you need to have something delivered somewhere by Tuesday at noon. Why don't you tell me what that is, and we'll find the best way to resource it. So I think one of the things you can do if you're faced with a resource request in a disaster is to ask some good questions about, where do you need it? What is it you think you need? And the most important question I ever ask when anybody calls me for a resource, which is frequently, is why? Why do you need it? And if you begin with why, great TED talk by Simon Sinek, beginning with why.
I love that one.
It's great, right? Yeah. If you start with why, you're going to think you will. That question reveals facts that you can use to better serve the public, and you can use to better meet the requirement.
Can I have an airplane?
Why? Why? I mean, what is it? How can I? And that's the other part of it is part of the.
Yeah, I also want to know that.
You want an airplane too? So part of it is also you ask what kind of questions you can ask. I think it's important that we ask each other in a disaster, how can I help you be successful? And you got to be sincere about that. You've got to be, generous of spirit, and you really have to be able to say, how can I help you do your job? Not doing your job. And that's a critical piece, I think, between convenience stores and private nonprofits and relief providers like the American Red Cross. The ideal situation is the sooner that the commerce can get back up, power's restored, supply chains restored. We want to get the private nonprofits and the relief agencies into recovery, and I think that's just a critical part of that partnership.
Jeff and I, both being in communications and marketing roles, I think you've stressed here a number of times about communication being key. I think both of us would agree with that. But when we're thinking about it from the retailer perspective, and certainly, when you're in it, it's different. You might think you're a great communicator or have the best intentions, but going back to what you said about preparedness being so important, what are some of the things that retailers can be doing to keep those lines of communication open before a disaster strikes?
If you're exchanging business cards when a disaster strikes, it's too late. So I think the question is, how can you have pre-disaster relationships, and who do you have them with? And I think for any local business, I would encourage you to who is your Red Cross chapter? Who's the regional disaster officer for the American Red Cross? Who runs the Salvation Army in your community, if there's a Salvation Army element to that? If you've got faith-based organizations, the Southern Baptists have a huge disaster mission all over the world. In the United States, they do feeding, right? There's a complete connection there. So is there a Southern Baptist mission in your community? The Southern Baptists are everywhere, not just in the South. And so I think it's understanding who the responders are. And one of the best ways for a business to do that is to connect with your local government emergency manager and to attend perhaps an emergency operations center meeting, meet the people who do this, who are involved in mass care. That doesn't mean you have to be there when a disaster happens, although that's not bad either, right? I mean, to be able to provide business expertise in a government operations center is critical. So that's what I'd say. Meet the local emergency manager, meet your private nonprofit partners that are in the community, and I think that's a really good first step.
And Stephanie, I think more than any other industry, or to a greater extent than most industries, convenience stores get to see the result of what they do. They get to see that they're part of the community, that collectively they contribute to charities or causes about $1 billion a year.
Yeah.
So they see it when somebody walks in and says, thank you. Can you tell us how you see it when you're out in the field and you just... There's just that story that just keeps you going beyond you want to do it, but it's just something that shows you how important what the work of the Red Cross is and the people who help support the Red Cross.
Absolutely. It takes a whole community to respond and recover from any disaster. And just a few days ago, I was talking with our team in Puerto Rico. And there was a family that was in an area that did not have sustained power and didn't have water delivery and food delivery. And the grandmother in the family had an oxygen condenser. She needed power for that, and she wouldn't be able to stay with the family if she couldn't get power. And we went to the power company and the folks doing restoration. They were like, the infrastructure damage is too bad. It's going to be a while. And so we went to one of our partners, Harbor Freight, and they donated generators, and we shipped those to Puerto Rico. And we were able to provide this household with a portable generator. So that didn't just provide health and safety and oxygen to the grandmother, it kept the family together. So when I see people in a community helping other people in the community keep their families together, stay with their loved ones, that is, it's an incredible feeling. If you respond to a house fire, and by the way, anyone can volunteer for the American Red Cross. If you hear my voice and you're like, well, that sounds like something I might want to do. Hey, you don't need to give us 1,000 hours a year. If you can do a couple hours on a weekend, if you can take a shift responding to disasters at night, if you want to deploy to one disaster for 10 days a year, if you want to help install smoke alarms, there's lots of ways to help. And so I think that you just get this incredible feeling. We have a smoke alarm program. We've saved.
That's interesting. Actually, you bring that up. I did not realize until we started talking more about our partnership, just the availability of that program.
It's fantastic. So if I'm a chain or I'm a local store and I want to help with this program, I can spend a couple hours a month helping to install smoke alarms in people's homes. You'd be amazed at how many homes do not have smoke alarms. By the beginning of 2018, that program had saved over 328 lives, directly connected to the installation of a smoke alarm that wasn't there beforehand. A fire erupted after the smoke alarm was installed, and but for the smoke alarm, people would have died. 328 lives. Think about that. 15 minutes on a Saturday afternoon, you're drilling in a smoke alarm. That's your community. You're saving lives in your community.
When you're a volunteer-based organization, the hardest thing is getting volunteers and keeping volunteers. So another opportunity, whether you're a retailer or whether you're a supplier, NACS is working with the American Red Cross and looking at how we can help, how we can all work together. That's what associations do.
Yeah.
But there's also opportunities if you want to work in the local community and contact your local chapter. As I mentioned, it's really hard to get and keep volunteers. Maybe there's a way to play a role, not only be a volunteer, but is there a way to look at programs where there might be some sort of free coffee for anybody that has a program? Those are the kind of things that we're looking at and see what might work. But until then, there are opportunities for local stores to try something
every day,
make that connection, make a difference. Right. Talking about 300 lives saved with fire alone, let alone the tens of thousands or millions that you affect just giving them comfort.
That's right. I mean, we talked earlier. So there's lots of ways that small businesses and convenience stores. So we've talked about some of them. You can volunteer with the Red Cross or any other volunteer organization in your community. You can help with the smoke alarm program that saves lives. You might want to provide donations in kind of food or coffee. Sometimes God help us, we've seen this increase of mass casualties and mass shootings in the country. Every time one of those happens, whether you know it or not, most of the times the American Red Cross is there. We're providing food and water and snacks for first responders. Well, when I say we're providing that, someone's given that to the Red Cross. So we're either buying it from a local vendor or we're receiving that food, water, and snacks in kind. Those are opportunities. A number of your members collect donations for the American Red Cross in the store, which is that philanthropy is incredibly important. It really, really is.
I think what we've talked about today hopefully is eye-opening or ear-opening, because we're on a podcast for many folks, that the breadth of programs that you all provide extends so far beyond just disaster relief in the form of hurricanes that we might traditionally think of, and the impact that you can have not just on a national level, but the fact that so many of our members are so focused within their own communities and they want to see that there's a direct impact, and you provide programs that allow them to do that.
We do. And, we provide shelter, feeding, comfort. Those are our major lines of service in disaster operations, and you can participate in any or all of those. And the other thing is, even after we've opened some ears on this podcast, people can go to redcross.org on the internet, and you can find out much more about these opportunities and, more importantly, where your local Red Cross is, so that you can call and connect. And that redcross.org is a great resource for folks.
Well, Brad, thank you for coming on today. It's terrible that there are natural disasters and there will be fires, various other things. We're delighted to work with the Red Cross to see how we can help mitigate the problems involved. So thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Jeff and Stephanie.
Convenience Matters is brought to you by NACS and produced in conjunction with Human Factor Media. For more information, visit convenience.org.